The American Revolution and the Civil War are so often discussed, but the period of time, a little less than 80 years between them, affected the country almost as significantly as both of them.
The Revolution ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, and the new nation of America was freed from British ruling.
The political leaders were eager to build their new government.
The Articles of Confederation was what the Americans used as the base of their government during the Revolution, but after the war ended, they could no longer rely on it.
In 1786, Shays' Rebellion began. Farmers were upset that they were given high taxes, and if they couldn't provide the money, they were punished. So they rebelled against the strict courts. This rebellion ended in 1787 and proved that America needed a stronger government.
On May 1st, 1787, the Constitutional Convention took place. The Constitution was signed in September after a long debate between the political leaders, who had organized themselves into two distinctive parties:
Federalists and Anti-Federalists.
Federalists, who included leaders such as George Washington and his aide-de-camp Alexander Hamilton, believed that the nation's power should be shared between the states and the central government, with the majority to the central.
While the Anti-Federalists were afraid of creating anything close to a monarchy and believed that the power should be held by the states and their local governments. Some well-known political leaders such as Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were members of the Anti-Federalist Party.
In October 1787, there were Federalist Papers, the majority written by Alexander Hamilton, supporting the Constitution.
New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution in June 1788, and it went into effect.
The last meeting of Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation was in October of 1788. Then in April 1789, Washington was inaugurated as president.
Once the Constitution was put into effect, America could finally begin to build its government. In August, the Department of War was established.
In September, the U.S. Department of Treasury was founded, and Hamilton became Secretary of Treasury.
In that same month, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution, and in 1791, the first Bank of America was established.
Rhode Island became the 13th colony, the last, in 1790, and was the last original colony to ratify the Constitution.
In 1793, President George Washington declared that in the conflict between France and Great Britain, the nation was neutral. This announcement was called the Proclamation of Neutrality.
The Whiskey Rebellion began in 1794, in which farmers and distillers in western Pennsylvania violently protested because of the whiskey tax they received from the federal government, who was trying to pay off debts from the war.
Washington, having his fair share of the political disputes rampant among the leaders in respective parties of the government, gave his farewell address in 1796.
John Adams was inaugurated the year after.
His presidency is commonly remembered for the Alien and Sedition Acts that he passed in 1798 and the XYZ affair.
The alien, referring to immigrants instead of little green men from outer space, and sedition, meaning treason or an organized rebellion against the government, were intended to place restrictions on those born in other countries and limit the speech of America's citizens. The XYZ affair, on the other hand, was an incident with the French, in which the quasi-war resulted.
This short conflict was known for being one of America's first major naval wars, having begun in 1789, lasted until 1801, the same year as Thomas Jefferson's ascension into presidency.
As we head into the 1800s, we see the foreign affairs and restrictive acts were not the only contributors to America's growth as a nation.
The judicial system and the many precedents they set during major cases were also significant, one in particular being the Marbury and Madison case of 1803 that gave the courts the power of judicial review.
Judicial review was the court's ability to declare an act as unconstitutional or not, if it was not clearly stated in the Constitution.
In 1803, a large expanse of land was purchased by the United States from France. Robert Livingstone was sent to France to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans. He was surprised when the French offered them territory that extended a ways west of the Mississippi River, including Louisiana. The U.S. agreed to purchase the land, and the exchange was remembered as Louisiana Purchase.
The Barbary Wars in 1805 was considered as America's first war on terror. The Barbary pirates were messing with America's trading ships.
The Embargo Act, made by Thomas Jefferson, was put into place in 1807. This act restricted imports from Britain and closed the U.S. port from all exports.
As a side note, the steamboat was invented by Robert Fulton in 1807.
In 1808, the U.S. slave trade with Africa, which had been around for almost 400 years, finally ended.
And in 1809, James Madison became the fourth president of the U.S.
Heading into the 1810s, the most significant event of this next decade was the War of 1812, which actually lasted until 1815.
Similar to the First Barbary War in 1805, America was forced to take action against foreign powers that were interfering with their trading system overseas in the War of 1812. This time it was Britain, in an attempt to block America's trade with France, who attacked the American merchant ships and even went as far as drafting the men found on these vessels into their own Royal Navy.
The battles were fought over land and sea, and as it was the second war America had fought against Britain, the War of 1812 was also called the Second War of Independence.
In the last year of the war, the British invaded America's capital and burnt down most of the city, including a large portion of the White House, which had only just been completed in 1800.
The Second War of Independence concluded with no determined victory, since each side simply wore the other down. The Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814, making the ceasefire official.
However, the last battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought in early 1815 and ended in an American victory credited to General Andrew Jackson and those he commanded.
After the war, America picked up where they left off, starting with the establishment of the Second Bank of America in 1816, as the charter for the first had expired a few years earlier.
Then, in 1817, James Madison was replaced by James Monroe, who was included in the negotiations with France over the Louisiana Territory in 1803.
Expansion became a main occurrence in the last years of the 1810s.
In 1812, Louisiana became the 18th state. Then Indiana joined in 1816, and Mississippi in 1817, with Illinois and Alabama following soon after.
And at the end of the 1810s, leading into the 20s, the Missouri Compromise was passed. The division it drew becoming more distinct the closer America got to the 1860s.
In James Monroe's presidency, his most significant undertaking was the Monroe Doctrine, which was a foreign policy established in 1823.
Essentially, the doctrine was America claiming the Western Hemisphere as their own to expand upon, and a message to other nations to not interfere with said expansion.
John Quincy Adams was next to take the presidential position in 1825, but his reign only lasted one term, and in 1829 Andrew Jackson, the former American general, replaced him.
Many of the events of the next decade, the 1830s, primarily impacted the Indian tribes still inhabiting the lands in the West.
At the tip of the iceberg of the 1830s is the Indian Removal Act, which moved most of the Indian tribes located to the east of the Mississippi to the land farther west.
Then in 1832, the Black Hawk War began, an Indian attack on the American settlements in Illinois, in an attempt to regain their homeland. The resistance was led by the Sauk leader Black Hawk.
This was just one of the many skirmishes the Americans had with the Indians, whom they continued to push farther and farther west. Another in 1835 was the Second Seminole War, in which Americans went to enforce a treaty signed by the Seminole Indians in the Florida Territory, only to begin another short war with Indians trying to hold on to what little land they had left. Despite the resistance, America continued to expand, even when they fell into their first depression, lasting from 1837 to the mid-1840s. The downtrend of the nation's economy began in 1832 as Andrew Jackson, during his time as president, failed to extend the charter for the Second Bank of America. So with the lack of a central bank system, America's economy spiraled into depression.
Martin Van Buren became president in 1837, the same year that the Depression hit, which was called the Panic of 1837. Although prices and incomes decreased, production and expansion via railroads continued, and America's population increased with it.
Also, during this time, specifically 1838 to 1839, was an event called the Trail of Tears, which was a part of the execution of the Indian Removal Act passed back in 1830.
It was called the Trail of Tears because thousands of the Indians, in their travels to areas of relocation, died of starvation or disease.
In 1841, William Henry Harrison became the 9th president, only to die 30 days after his inauguration, and replaced by the 10th, John Tyler.
One of the most important events in the 1840s was the Mexican-American War that went from 1846 to 1848.
In this war, Mexico fought the Americans over the territory of Texas after it was admitted as the 20th state of the American nation.
America succeeded in not only keeping Texas but in gaining the land containing the modern-day states of New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and California.
After recently coming out of the depths of depression, America received a small boost in the economy due to the gold rush in California during the 1849 to early 1850s.
1850 is home to an event that was a major instigator to the Civil War looming just beyond the decade, the Fugitive Slave Act. This act made it so that even if slaves escaped to the northern free states, they would be forced to return to their owners if found.
Tensions over slavery disagreements would spike in the next few years, and the states had already begun to divide themselves using northern and southern distinctions as free and slave ones.
By the end of the 1850s, the next major war for America was just on the horizon, and the previous had sunk far behind them.
The country, once united in their fight for independence, would soon fight among those of their own nation over one of the most common forms of oppression in history. They would once again fight over freedom, however, unlike in the Revolution, not for themselves but for their slaves.